So as we said in the introduction, whenever I said where we were going and I said Ohio, Ontario, Michigan, Minnesota, it started to sound like those old-time railroads, like the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe. So we thought it sort of sounded like a railroad. So Eric put on his engineer hat and got his train whistle. So that's enough, dear. But it actually was the 7 intrepid explorers braved north winds and high waters to encounter migrating birds around the Great Lakes. With special thanks to Charlie Keller for his checklist and photographic contributions. And away we go. So in the introduction, we also mentioned how birds are migrating north and actually south as well. As you see the line of little blue ducks there, this is a illustration of waterfowl migration. But the blue line is the Mississippi Flyway, and the birds flying up there tend to encounter the Great Lakes, which presents a little bit of a challenge for them getting where they want to go. So they have to, this is Lake Erie. This is where we first went in northern Ohio along along Lake Erie, and the birds tend to pile up on the Ohio side, and then when the weather's right, then they fly across the lake, and many of them land at Point Pelee, which was our goal ultimately for this part of the country. But I just put this little map in to give you an idea of it's a pretty good. It took us about 4 hours to drive from Port Clinton down there in the lower left around to Leamington at Point Pelee National Park. So it's a fairly good distance, and there's this island is actually part of Canada's Pelee Island, and a lot of the birds pile up there as well. So that's a goal for a next trip, is we want to get over to Pelee Island. But there's a lot of birds that pile up where we went. So our first stop was the North Ohio shore, and I saw lots of bird license plates while we were there. There's also a 10-day birding extravaganza that goes on around the Port Clinton area just about the time we were there. So we saw lots of other birders as well. So we visited Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. And saw neat sandhill cranes, tree swallows, oddly colored trumpeter swans.
They were the most common swan we saw.
Bald eagle. And then we have a food fight going on here with more bald eagles in one spot than I've ever seen. The one on the bottom there ends up getting the prize. We couldn't even tell if it was food, but they all wanted it. So the first orchard we saw was the orchard oriole, which is very rare around here. Much of this area, and also up at Point Pelee, and when we went to Minnesota, is natural bog or swampland. And things were just beginning to leaf out in Ohio. So in some parts, we got lots of leaves in other parts, but it made it a little bit easier to find the birds when the vegetation looks like this. And this is an interesting snake that we saw that I think was trying to keep itself warm by wrapping up itself. And downy woodpecker. This is a red-bellied woodpecker, and you might say, why do you call it a red-bellied woodpecker? And it's because if you look really, really close, there's a little bit of red on the belly, but you pretty much have to hold it upside down to see that very well. Had some wildflowers, very few. White-crowned sparrow, black-capped chickadee, mud.
It wasn't warm.
This was just some very pretty fresh foliage that I couldn't resist taking a picture of. And a very rufusy song sparrow. Now I know why orioles are attracted to oranges, except ours aren't, but the ones back east sure were. Lots of Canada geese and goslings. This is actually 2 gray water snakes. I think they're keeping warm. And this is east of Port Clinton, where we stayed. We had this, they had like 1 bird feeder out on this pull-out area that was a bone of contention. So the red-bellied woodpecker won, but not for long, because the grackles showed up. So there's a red-winged blackbird and the grackle. The red-winged blackbird almost looks like our tricolor, but it's not. It's the eastern redwings have a lighter color often on their yellow than ours do. And this is the best look we had, at least bittern, but this is the best look we had of it. It was
surprised the heck out of me because I also associate leaf bittern with the more tropical habitat like the Salton Sea. But look at the range map, and sure enough, up they go.
This is downtown Port Clinton. Port Clinton is literally right on the Erie shore, and the winds were blowing from the north. Lake Erie is a pretty shallow lake, and so when the winds blow from the north or the northeast, it pushes the water up on land, and the streets flood. And then when the wind stops, the water goes down. So it's kind of an interesting experience for us. A little cafe humor here. I actually put this one up at work too. And the tables had ads for local businesses. And the one that caught our eye the most was, "We paint cranks." It's like, what would you do with a crank? Apparently you fish with a crank, but that was a new one for us. And they have some very easy to find birds that are quite large. There's a beautiful mural on the side of a building in Port Clinton. And then McGee Marsh. This is one of the meccas, certainly of the North Ohio shore. And it's a beautiful boardwalk that goes through swampland and some little bit drier habitat. And it's just right at the water. It's very loaded with birds. It's really amazing.
But because of the festival, it was very crowded.
That will illustrate that in a few minutes. She says pretty swampy. And there's a little tiny eastern screech owl tucked up in there. Some of the trees were leafing out pretty well, which made it a little bit more challenging. But so I want to point out the size of the leaves. We'll get back to that a little bit later on. So here we have a part of the walkway, and there's a catbird that was busy doing its business over here, completely ignoring the people walking by. But this view of the boardwalk was very unusual. This is more like it. See all the cameras pointing up there? There was one point where we were looking at a bird that was almost directly ahead of us, and I had my camera up. I couldn't bring my arms down because there were so many people so closely around us. So that was a little bit, a little unnerving and a little frustrating. Thank you again, Stephanie, for the picture, because I think I was so anxious about getting out of the crowds. I didn't take any pictures of them. So fortunately, Stephanie did. So here's the eastern version, the myrtle warbler of our yellow-rumped. So pretty and so cooperative. So they were hungry and getting ready to move on, and they didn't care we were there. They didn't even care there were crowds there. This is a little apple tree that was just sitting in the middle of everything, I think. Not naturally. And this is another little Cape May warble. It was cold, and it was really fluffing out its feathers to warm up, and it looked like it had ruffled its petticoat. This is one of my all-time favorites. And apparently it was an all-time favorite of Roger Tory Peterson as well. He called it fire throat. And I think, well, a good name for it. Gorgeous bird. And this was the bird where it was so crowded that I couldn't move my camera around. But Charlie got some good shots of the yellow-billed cuckoo. This is a parking lot bird, a bald eagle right in the parking lot. And this was after we got through the marsh on our first walk through and survived the crowds to make it back to the parking lot. And this is Metzger Marsh, which is adjacent to McGee Marsh, and it was, I mean, the lake was basically just coming right in to the parking lot. And another area that's supposed to be it's a little bit inland, and one would think a little drier, but nope.
Wow.
Another wildflower. Ooh. You probably don't need the fire hydrant today. Fortunately, though, we didn't get a whole lot of heavy rain. I mean, it was mostly wind, a lot of wind. And we drove past this generating station at least twice a day, every day. It was not as aesthetic as some of the rest of it, but the gas prices were good. This Erica was driving this day, so we're heading now, heading for Michigan, and having to cross. It's supposed to be a bridge, but it's actually a water flow. And then this is what happens to your windshield as you're going through. And I thought this was a lovely bridge. This is at Toledo, Ohio, and it's called the Veterans Glass City Skyway Bridge. So I thought, why do they call it Glass City? And this because it's one of the nicknames for Toledo, because in the late 1800s, a number of glass making firms settled there in Toledo. And that was, learn something new every day, but it was a pretty bridge. So we're swinging through Michigan on our way to Ontario. So you get a Michigan license plate. We stopped at Point Mooley State Game Area, which was fairly well flooded as well. It's on the western Lake Erie shore. So there are some ring-billed gulls there in the picture, but it was pretty meager for birds all in all, but a gorgeous horned grebe. Oops. Oh, we don't want to paint anything, come on. And they have a waterfowl festival there as well. Many of these areas are also hunting areas, so they focus a lot on waterfowl.
And fishing.
And fishing. And there's some fairly chilled tree swallows there. And a groundhog, this was taken through the windshield, so that's a little bit fuzzy. Groundhog or woodchuck. And I grew up in New England, so when I was putting the picture, and I thought, okay, now what's the answer to how much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? And I Googled it, and on the North Dakota Game and Fish website, I found an answer that they don't actually chuck wood, but they can chuck a heck of a lot of dirt, up to 700 pounds in one day. Yeah. And so then I thought, well, why do they call it a woodchuck if they don't chuck wood? And the answer was the early English settlers in New England called it Woochuck, which was apparently a corruption of a Native American name that's been lost to history. And so it's called woodchuck because they modified it even more.
So a life mammal for me.
Yeah. It's also, it's in the same genus as our yellow-bellied marmot, so close relative. And I like being out with more than one birder because we see things from different angles. More water. And then here we have the adventure of getting a big van through water, which we succeeded in doing. And now Ontario. We went first to Hillman Marsh. We actually went back to Hillman Marsh again. It's the best place that we found for ducks on that part of the country. And it's supposed to be a lot of shorebirds, but the water was so high, there wasn't much shore for the shorebirds. So it was a bit of a fright. We did see an ovenbird while we were there. Didn't get a picture, but saw it. And this one goose was standing across the marsh from us with at least 60 goslings with her of different ages. So I don't know if she was the nanny or what, but it was
I think that's a safe assumption.
it's a lot of baby geese over there. This is inside of the shelter at the marsh. And a lovely yellow warbler. And going back to the days of bird class, I always like birds that give you every angle to evaluate to get your ID right. Oops. And this is just between the camera batteries and the radios and the cell phones. And I'm sure I overdid the amount of electricity I was supposed to use, but I did anyway. So off to Point Pelee, which same illustration. Basically, this actually was a question on Jeopardy, is the southernmost point of mainland Canada. And juts out into Lake Erie. Pele in French is bald. It's a bald point in French. And this is a map of the park, and it's I think 7 kilometers from top to bottom, so it can be a fairly long walk. But fortunately, they provide a tram, so you can take the tram down close to the point and then work your way back, or take various trails, or even bike it, things like that. And they, of course, provide or sell breakfast and lunch for birders in French and English. And every morning or continually in the visitor center, they update current sightings in both English and French. And I thought some of these names are sort of interesting. For instance, the solitary sandpiper in French is chevalier, solitaire, and chevalier is like a knight. So I thought that was sort of an interesting term to use for sandpipers. And the yellow-breasted chat's second name in French is polyglot, or many-tongued, also very appropriate. So it was sort of fun to look at the names.
Unlike McGee Marsh, there are many trails, and even though there were a fair number of people, there was never the same congestion. In fact, any bird we saw that was uncommon, there were still only half a dozen people maybe, and so there was plenty of opportunity to see it well and get pictures, and they offer many guided walks, which we took advantage of several, and you get to go see things like the woodcock doing their display in the evening. It's wonderful.
So that's Point Pelee, the end of it. Pretty bald, although it can have birds. And the birds have names. Although you can't get very close, they have a barrier where you're not supposed to go beyond it to walk all the way out there. And it's partly because it can be pretty wild and windy and stormy out there. So when I mentioned the leaves with the owl picture in Ohio, there weren't any leaves at Point Pelee. There was only the low brush. So many of the birds were knee high or lower, which is just astounding for looking at them. So that we saw many Nashville warblers. I don't think any of them above eye level. This is a rather wet blue-winged warbler. Appropriately in Canada. This is a young man who joined one of our guided tours. He's obviously a local. And every day we would discuss, do we need 3 layers today or 4 layers? Because it was so cold, and not that much of a problem for him. Now, we don't usually see chestnut-sided warblers on the ground, but we saw lots of them on the ground there. A little brown creeper. And part of the park was formerly people's homes, and we would see things like forsythia just sitting there, which had been planted in somebody's garden originally, and daffodils sitting out in the forest that someone had originally planted. So it's kind of striking at times. Oh, pretty baby. Gorgeous American redstart. And I think this sort of strutting his stuff and flashing his tail and being a redstart. They have a boardwalk and a viewing tower at a sort of open marsh area, and it was very windy and quite cold here. We didn't all make it around the boardwalk, but those, here's the lake again.
One of the rare birds they wanted to show us was a coot.
They're pretty excited, but we were excited about the common goldeneye, so. This is Stephanie, and at one point I looked over and there's actually a warbler between Stephanie's feet, but in this picture there's actually a little chestnut-sided warbler on the ground, just a foot or so in front of her foot. They were so hungry and they were so tired, you were in danger of actually stepping on them. Another wildflower. Eastern towhee, no spots. Golden crown kinglet. I think one of Eric's favorite wildflowers is.
Yeah.
And some of the paths were marked as seasonal. This one wasn't this season. It had to wait a few weeks for it to dry out. Pretty wet. Oops. Another orchard oriole. Eastern bluebird. Gorgeous Baltimore. But every one of them was gorgeous. Another little black and white. Violet color number 2. There's a bat tucked up under one of the information kiosks. And the tramway ends basically at parallel 42. So we were at the 42nd parallel, farther south in Seattle, but we were in Canada. And so they have a very patriotic, pretty sign there to mark it. It's also a big migration place for monarch butterflies. There's a gorgeous blackberry. God, they're pretty birds. Those are alongside the beach, near the point. The prairie warbler. And then saw the mama on it, and then she left, and the babies were yelling, and she wouldn't come back while I was standing there. So I finally decided maybe it's because I was standing there and left. And didn't expect to see cacti. This is the view Charlie had of the Kentucky warbler at a couple times that we saw it.
This is one of the ground skulking ones. It's really hard to see.
This is a more typical view.
A good view.
And wild violet color number 3. Mrs. Rose-breasted. And a barn swallow gathering up some mud to go up and put on the nest. One of the many thrushes we saw.
The area has the most ethereal call. We didn't get to hear it call, but it's beautiful.
And this bird and I had about 10 minutes together with nobody on the path, nobody around us, just the two of us. It's so gorgeous. Charlie got a good shot of it. It was just mind-boggling how beautiful they are. And then, whoops, back up. This was pretty cool. This is a black-billed cuckoo that was sitting 2 feet off the ground for hours. There were this is actually the biggest cluster of people that we had at Point Pelee. This is a very cooperative bird. It just sat there, moved around a little, so we got a couple different views of it, and it just is pretty cool. So we're still in Ontario. Got another sign there, and then this area was labeled as the home of the Prothonotary warbler. So we spent quite a bit of time. It says, limit your stay in the area to 5 minutes. We stayed a little longer than that. We didn't see any prothonotarius. We went back again later, and I think again the next day, and didn't see any prothonotarius. But finally, in a swamp, we found one. And we were absolutely thrilled. And there was a man there with a huge camera, and he said, it's just a female. Obviously jaded. Yes, he did. He sure did. But we thought she was lovely. Northern water thrush. This license plate, Eric and I first saw our first trip to Point Pelee 15 years ago. And our email is Mott-Mott's. So we left a little note on the windshield and got an email back from them saying that, because we asked if it was French or if it was Mott-Mott. And they said it's both because we're birders and we're French. So they're French Canadian. And so the same license plate still there, a little worse for the wear and on a newer vehicle. So we left them another note, but this time we didn't get a response. So it's kind of fun. And this is heading back into Michigan from Ontario, going over the Ambassador Bridge between Windsor, Ontario and Detroit. So the Michigan state bird is the mosquito. No, not really. We had a large toad greet us at the door to our hotel. And we went into Michigan, northern part of southern Michigan, to Mayo, Michigan, not Mio, Mayo, Michigan, with the purpose of seeing the Kirtland's warbler, one of the rarest warblers that has a very specific habitat. And we went to the Huron-Manistee National Forest headquarters for a meeting before we were taken out to the warbler area. And they have this gorgeous quilt in there, which has also Kirtland's warbler with binoculars. They know what people come for. And you can't go in there unaccompanied by a forest service person, basically for 2.5 months while the warblers are breeding. So we had a fairly good sized group, and we spent the first part of the morning looking at them from a long distance.
They're very loud, and we could hear them. They have very specific nesting requirements. They need jack pines that are of a certain age, and so normally fire is one of the things that determines habitat, but they can artificially do some maneuvering to make it more habitat. And we kept hearing it, but we got a little glimpse here and there, but finally
we got some good looks and some good sounds. So that was pretty thrilling.
Apparently they're expanding their range, which is good too.
And one interesting thing about their nesting is they nest in jack pine, but they have to be fairly young jack pine with the lowest branches touching the ground, because they actually nest on the ground under the low branches. So it's a very, they keep having to reforest areas to keep turning it over so it's got the right maturity for the warblers. And we were there, I think, on the 15th of May or the 17th of May, and the first ones had shown up on the 15th. So we almost missed them. So we did a little driving around the area as well, since we did so well. Now here's a red-headed woodpecker, and I don't have to draw you a red arrow to show you why it's got its name.
Another famous redhead.
It is obviously a very handsome turkey. He proceeded to show us just how handsome he was. Ladies in the back don't seem to care. This little guy was outside the window of our hotel room. He said he was just a cute little ground squirrel. And we had dinner 2 nights actually at a pizza place that had featured a Mustang in the dining room, and hunting bows and arrows and rifles, and it was different. But the food was pretty good. We also went to Tawas Point, which is another famous staging area for the migrating birds. They show you how they go around the lake and around Saginaw Bay there. And I thought this little guy was just perching there, but when he actually stuck his face in there, little Cape May warbler was actually eating orange. So I just don't know why birds that live where oranges grow don't eat them, but And another gorgeous Baltimore oriole. Brown thrasher. They had some feeders out here at the point, and
this is the hummingbird of the East, which we saw only a few.
It's easy to know if you see a hummingbird, it's going to be a ruby-throated. You don't have to usually think too hard. So now we're down again at the lakeshore, Lake Huron.
Okay.
Oops, go back. Wait.
Yes. These are Dunlin, which should get a name change. Black-bellied sandpiper would be much more appropriate than being named for Dunn.
Although in the wintertime, it's a pretty good name. Oops, I'm still going backwards. Let me go forward here. So indigo bunting, gorgeous. It's a bird. That's why its pictures there. The blue jay, little eastern chipmunk. He was there for a long period of time, scarfing up the sunflower seed that had fallen down from the feeder. His cheeks were all puffed up and he was soaking wet, but he didn't care. Can almost call this indiglow. It's so blue. And here's a young North American porcupine and a profile. Cute, but I wouldn't want to pet it. Old style lighthouse. Birders at the point. Oops. That was an eastern gray squirrel, but the black morph. So we stopped at a place to have lunch to get something to warm up our insides. And they had a couple of amusing signs up. This one says, there are two theories to arguing with a woman. Neither one works. So some of us found that amusing. And this is back out in the forest again. There's an open air outhouse, which can have some problems associated with it, but they did at least put a cover over the toilet paper so that the toilet paper would stay dry. And now most of us flew to Minneapolis and drove up towards Duluth. Our target was the Sax-Zim Bog, which is a little bit northeast of Duluth. And it's a 300 square mile area of bog and forest and hills and lakes and all kinds of different habitat, that some of which is privately owned, some is national forest, some is state forest, and some is owned by the Friends of Sax-Zim Bog. They now have, I think, 524 acres. Oops. So this is a discussion about it. It's wonderful because a great gray owl, blackback woodpecker, boreal chickadee, yellow-bellied flycatcher, and Connecticut warbler all nest there. And you're supposed to be able to see bobcat, lynx, pine marten, fisher. We're still looking for those. And then in the wintertime, especially in a really good year, you can get great gray owls, northern hawk owls, white-winged crossbills, pine grosbeaks, common redpoll, and hoary redpoll. We went back in 2002 and saw 30 great gray owls. I think we had 3 snowy owls.
No, 3 hawk owls.
Three hawk, no, but we had 2 snowy owls. 2 snowy owls, I guess. One of the snowy owls was at the airport, and that was back in the days when you didn't feel weird using your telescope to look out the window at the airport. So, at any rate, it's a marvelous place, and they do warbler walks, which unfortunately had filled up before we got there. This is
the nature center, is only open in the winter.
Oh, it's open a little bit in the spring too. Anyway,
but that's when most people come.
So there's a lot of private homes in the area too, and Mary Lou is one of the people who's very friendly to birders and has feeders out, and you're welcome to go visit her and park in her driveway. But you don't park out in the street or across the street, because the lady across the street is not birder friendly. She actually came out and yelled at us.
We were looking at her.
It's like, she actually had feeders out, which is really sad because she had some birds at her feeder. But anyway, it's a different part of the world. So she has some neat birds at her feeders. So it's the papas, and there's the mamas.
We had a female purple finch a few weeks ago. You know.
You can't see the hairy woodpecker's bill too well here, but I like this for a size comparison between the hairy and the downy. And here's the little myrtle warblers eating grape jelly. So Mary Lou's got a great attitude. This is the headquarters for the visitor center for the bog, and they have naturalists who are there, and they give you the opportunity to buy purple T-shirts with great gray owls on them and other lovely things. And they do lead some bird walks as well. But everybody was tied up doing something when we were there, so unfortunately we didn't get to do it. We've managed to find a few things on our own though, like bobolinks. This is downtown Hibbing, Minnesota. Famous for being Bob Dylan's hometown. Kind of not much else to say for it. And this is downtown, is the Duluth Drawbridge. And it's a neat drawbridge because the way it works is this section right here goes up and down. So when the cars are going, it comes down here, cars go across. If a big ship, because they have big almost ocean liners and ore barges and things that are huge, then this part goes up into this top section so the tall ships can go through. It's a pretty amazing contraption. And over here is Grandma's Restaurant, which besides being home to some of the best wild rice chicken soup you can imagine, is also the original sponsor of Grandma's Marathon, which Eric did 2 years ago.
18.
Yeah, 2 years ago, which runs along the shore of Lake Superior. It's a very popular marathon, but they're a main sponsor of it. And I don't usually take pictures of food, but this lemon cake it was as good as it looks. It was a pretty spectacular thing. So we drove up. We took part of one day or most of one day and drove up part of the shore of Lake Superior and then across to Ely and back down to Hibbing, hoping for different habitats and different birds. So we stopped in 2 harbors.
Which is where the marathon, basically where the marathon starts.
Yeah. So here they've got, this is close to the iron range where they mine iron ore and then take it down to the lake and dump it here with the big machinery. And then they have this wharf, I guess, that goes out and they put the iron stuff on the little trains and pull them out here and dump them onto the ships, but they didn't cooperate and show up for us today, but it's quite a monster out there. And there were black-bellied plovers along the shore. Such handsome birds. Red-breasted merganser. And then we discovered roadside rest areas were pretty good for birds as well.
Minnesota, they're more like a hotel. They have large areas, they're fancy, they're clean, they have all sorts of extras like bird feeders outside.
Visitor information. It's very, very nice. Minnesota actually prides itself in how well it takes care of its roads as well. They have more miles of road than any other state, and they really take very good care of them. In fact, we were talking with a lady who was complaining, I think it was when we were there in 2018, complaining about all the litter, and we're going,
no, we said there wasn't any litter. And she said, oh yes, there was.
And we're going, oh man, you don't know litter, lady. But anyway, it's very interesting use of a big water jug to keep the squirrels from getting up to the bird feeder. And on our way back down to Minneapolis, we stopped at a rest area and had a pine warbler in the grass, along with about 100 high school kids who were walking back and forth and paying no attention. I'll say, so maybe next time. When Eric and I were there in 2018, we saw 2 bears. One of them was
2 wolves.
And one of the bears was just walking down the road.
But we still haven't seen the Connecticut warbler. We saw 30 species of warbler.
29.
29, sorry.
We've been to Point Pelee 3 times, and every time we go, we see 29 species of warblers.
Will we
different
ever
ones.
break this
It's the
marvelous
spell.
ceiling?
All right, so that's the end of our presentation.
Yay.
Yeah. Yay, the end.
Yay.
That was great.
Yeah, enjoyed that.
Thank you.
So we would love to have, we want to go again, and
Luckily, it's not going anywhere, so that's good.
yes, yeah. Although, as with everywhere else, everything got canceled this year, but
Those are great.
What month was that?
we were in there in May.
May?
Yeah. And it was colder than usual. The first time we were there, it was not that cold.
It was pretty nice.
Yeah, but
Okay.
the timing is good, especially for Point Pelee, because the birds are right there on the ground looking at you, and they're not up in the trees hiding behind leaves. So
But it's distressing as much as the birds are suffering that there's obviously not enough food that they can't. But
Hi,
anyway,
this is Bob Kaplan. Good to see you folks.
hi.
I've got a question for you. The map, it was nice showing the 4 flyways. And well, I wondered, why are there 4? Why aren't there 2? Why aren't there 3? Why aren't there 6?
I think it's largely geographic. Basically, the eastern flyway is like from the Allegheny Mountain. Basically, there's a series of mountains going up the East Coast. They call them mountains, but they are fairly good sized mountains. But oh shoot, I can't think of the one in the south. But anyway, it's sort
The
of
Appalachians,
pardon?
the Appalachian Mountains.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to think of. Thank you. So I think the birds sort of naturally channel up the sides of those, and on the West Coast they sort of channel up the sides of the Sierra and then the Rockies, and then in the middle there's some that sort of hug the Rockies and some that go up the Mississippi. So it's, I think, mostly geographical, and probably also the way the winds blow, maybe as a result of the geography.
those maps were generated by the fish and game people and the duck. They, they ring that they've put rings on the bands on the ducks, and these are all sightings. So it's the natural flow of the waterfowl more than.
And it's pretty similar to what the lambirds follow as well. Does that help?
Unfortunately, in the West, if you look at the map more closely, most of the water birds stop at about the Sacramento Delta. So that's why we don't get huge numbers flying over our heads in the winter or the fall. But if you're
And are the flyways, the other flyways, facing similar issues to the one along the Pacific coast, where stopping points for the birds are sort of drying up because swamps or marshes get drained and estuaries and cities and towns get built up in their place?
Yeah, I think that's basically a problem everywhere, although I think it's worse on the coast than it is in the center of the country, just because there's more people on the coast. But yeah, habitat loss is definitely affecting migrants everywhere.
especially the potholes, the low areas and farms that many of the waterfowl use for nesting. Yeah, but they're making progress, talking with farmers that leave part of their field natural, as it were, so we can have more. And that's good for the duck hunters, because they have to have something to shoot.
Yeah, right. They support that. And do the birds ever cross flyways? Does people ever sight one from an adjacent flyway, or is there any point where they converge down below or up on top?
Well, many of them funnel through Central America to get to South America, the ones that aren't brave enough or crazy enough to fly over large patches of water. So there is a funneling effect that goes through. And I've seen pictures from Panama City of just the sky full of hawks flying through. But occasionally you do get vagrants who get off course and show up here that aren't supposed to be over here. But they're not very common. We do have occasionally, I know down in San Diego a few years ago, they had a ruff that wintered down there many years in a row in the same place on the bay. F Street on the bay. And I was like, how did it get there and why did it come back? Who knows, but it did. I think a few of them have crossed wires in their brains or something.
There's more, if you look at a map of the nesting, a lot of the eastern birds nest in Western Canada, and a lot of the range may be expanding even farther west. So normally they would go southeast to go south in the fall, but some of them go southwest, and so they slide down the coast. So that's why a coastal place like South Coast Botanic Garden has a bigger bird list than the Arboretum, even though the Arboretum's been there forever and has a natural lagoon, and you would think it'd be more, but the location. But.
You know, I'm really, this might be a beginner's question, but I'm really very amazed at how most of the warblers were on the ground. I never see warblers.
It's mind-boggling to see it too, because as I say, you're not in the trees. There's nothing in the trees.
So is that a phenomenon of the Midwest, or?
No, it's just the timing. The trees hadn't leafed out. The only place there was food was on the ground, and there wasn't that much.
Yeah, that makes sense.
When we go to the bog in Minnesota, the experts are standing out in the middle of the road, and you identify most things by sound, because the bog is really
Dense.
and wet and pretty impenetrable unless you get pretty. So that's more normal for that kind of habitat. In fact, there's a story. Roger Torrey Peterson in his home in Connecticut, visiting birders, and they went out and looked and stuff and saw X number of species. Meanwhile, he was back in this studio, probably doing one of his paintings, which pained him because he'd rather be out birding, but he heard more species than they saw. So birding, is a better term, if nothing else. The experts can identify probably 90% just from the sounds.
Yes. If you can hear, if you can hear well.
Right. No, that's a challenge.
It's a lot easier.
So what we like to do is we like to have a group that has some people with good ears and people with good eyes, and then we all get to see it.
Yes, exactly. Good idea.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier when you're starting, if you can learn the two together. It's definitely harder to learn the songs by themselves. Even people I thought that had musical ability, it's not that easy. So it's a different wiring.
Well, are there any more questions? Okay. Well, thank you, Eric, for a great presentation.
You're very welcome.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a great presentation.
Yeah.
Loved it.
very interesting.